In the shadowed quiet of dawn, Ella's hands trembled as she pressed a tattered cloth against the deep gash across the Apache warrior's torso. His breaths came ragged, eyes flickering with pain and mistrust. "Stay alive," she whispered, voice steady, but heart pounding, knowing this act of mercy could either save him or seal her doom. Outside, unseen eyes watched the isolated ranch, and fate was already shifting like dust in a sudden wind. The endless sweep of the frontier stretched beyond her weathered porch. Red earth cracked beneath the burning sun, sagebrush swayed in restless whispers, and the distant jagged mountains stood as silent sentinels. Ella's rancho stood alone, a fragile island in the vastness where the horizon met sky in a fierce, unforgiving embrace. The wind carried not only the scent of dry cedar and scorched soil, but an undercurrent of threat lingering like a coming storm. Ella, pulled tight by years of solitude and hardships, bore the hard lines of survival on her face. Beneath that hardened exterior, a conflicted heart beat, resolute, haunted, yet unwilling to turn away a wounded man who collapsed, desperate, at her threshold. The law of the land, whispered warnings by neighbors, and the bitter wound of endless conflict all warned her. Harboring a member of a tribe so feared could bring ruin. Yet her compassion overpowered fear. The question nagged like an ache. Could mercy and humanity survive where guns ruled justice? But the fragile peace they forged was a spark in dry grass. Word swept swift across the arid winds to the Apache camp. The gesture that Ella had offered in quiet desperation was no secret for long. Soon after dark, distant voices, measured and grave, spoke in tones fierce and urgent. By dawn, the stillness shattered under the rhythmic pounding of hooves. Warriors of the Apache emerged from the scrub, their faces painted in blood-red streaks, eyes sharp as arrows. They encircled the rancho with a silent menace that froze Ella's breath. These were neither foes easily swayed, nor simple emissaries of peace, but guardians of tribal law and wrath, holding the balance of honor and vengeance in their hands. Within the walls of the small cabin, the Apache man, tied to life by Ella's care, shared wary, guarded glances with her. His presence was a heavy reminder. Every act of kindness bore a cost. Their fragile truce hung on whispers and heartbeats, the space between hope and disaster narrowing with every breath. The tension thickened, carved deep by history and shadowed by uncertainty. And then, at the break of day, the heavy silence fractured. The warriors circled tight, their horses stamping in unison, breaths steaming in the chill morning air. Ella stood at the threshold, heart pounding in her chest like war drums. No words were spoken, only the weight of their gazes, the unmistakable message. Her mercy set a storm in motion, and nowhere to hide from its fury. The rancho, once a sanctuary, was now the stage of a reckoning that would test every ounce of her courage and the fate of the man she chose to save. The frontier was watching, breath held, poised on the knife edge between war and an impossible understanding. Many fellow wanderers who follow our frontier legends have told us that fate, or the treacherous YouTube algorithm, sometimes undoes their subscriptions without warning. Before the next perilous trail unfolds and a new twist arrives, take a quick glance below the video and make sure you're still subscribed to our band to not lose the thread of the story. We don't want you to miss any of the voices echoing through this valley. Check your subscription now and join our saga. The sun rose higher, casting pale light over the tense scene at Ella's rancho. The Apache warriors stood like statues, their painted faces carved from stone, eyes never wavering from the fragile shelter they surrounded. Inside, Ella's breath barely stirred as she knelt beside the wounded man, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. Every ragged breath he took was a promise and a warning. The warrior's eyes, sharp and wary, flicked toward the encircling figures outside, a silent communication of fear, anger, and duty. He barely trusted the woman who had saved him, yet no other option remained. The deep gash across his ribs throbbed with each pulse, a brutal reminder of how close death hovered. Ella pressed the cloth tighter, willing the pain to dull with the faintest touch of saliva and sweat. Beyond the thin walls, the horse hooves stirred dust that danced like restless spirits. From the corner of her eye, Ella glimpsed shadows moving, watchful, unyielding. The lawless wilderness offered no guarantees, only hard choices. A sudden sharp whistle sliced through the air, low and commanding. One warrior stepped forward, breaking the silent circle. His voice was grave but measured, mixing words in Apache tongue and broken Spanish. Ella's ears caught fragments, but the message was unmistakable. A choice demanded: justice or mercy, exile or death. Ella met his gaze, unflinching. "He is hurt. He would die without help," she spoke quietly, voice carrying the weight of conviction. The men exchanged uneasy glances, the ancient code of their people clashing with the raw reality of survival. The warrior on the floor opened his mouth to speak, a slow, rasping sound that crashed over the stillness like a fractured melody. "Must pay debt," he whispered, eyes locking on Ella's. His words were a vow and a curse, intertwined. She understood. Harboring him was no simple kindness. It was a binding act that tangled her fate with his wounds and their justice. The tension rippled through the cabin like heat waves across the desert. The air thickened as ancient ghosts of vengeance and forgiveness clashed beneath the low wooden beams. Ella's gaze softened with a flicker of empathy, recalling the endless cycles of blood that had torn the frontier apart for decades. In the silence that followed, a child's cry, barely audible, yet piercing, broke through the fierceness outside. Ella's eyes darted to the doorway, just as a small figure stepped into view. A girl, no more than 7, her dark eyes wide and shimmering with tears, clutching a worn doll. The warrior stiffened, the spell of hostility briefly shattered. The child's presence was a fragile reminder of innocence amid hardened lives. Ella reached out gently, beckoning the girl closer. In that small moment, the walls between them seemed thinner, fragile as dry leaves. "Is she yours?" one of the warriors asked, voice soft but edged with suspicion. Ella nodded slowly. "She is all I have left." The girl's small hand found Ella's, fingers trembling but seeking warmth. The wounded warrior turned his gaze from the encircling foes to the bond forming within those crowded walls. Here lay the fragile pulse of humanity, hope clinging stubbornly to survival. Suddenly, a sharp noise shattered the fragile calm. The heavy wooden door burst open, splintering under a brutal force that sent dust billowing into the air. Figures swarmed into the room, men cloaked in the dark green of the territorial patrol, rifles drawn, eyes cold and unforgiving. "Ella, step aside," arced the patrol leader, his voice a whip cracking through silence. "This man is under arrest. You've harbored an enemy of the territory." Ella's body tensed, a quiet fury igniting behind her composed surface. She planted herself firmly before the wounded warrior, shielding him. "He is no enemy," she said steadily. "Not while he is bleeding on my floor." The patrol surged forward, but the Apache warriors exploded into action, forming a living shield. Hooves thundered, weapons flashed, the air thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and dust. The fragile truce shattered like glass underfoot. Ella grabbed the warrior's arm, whispering against the chaos, "We must move, now." Pain flared across his face, but his grip tightened. Around them, the world exploded into screams, curses, and the relentless pounding of hooves. The ranch, once a sanctuary, carved from dust and hope, became a battlefield where alliances were forged in desperation, and old wounds bled anew. In the midst of the storm, Ella caught a glimpse of the child, clutching her doll, eyes shining with terror and wonder, mirroring a future uncertain. As the clash escalated beyond the cabin walls, a sudden, chilling whistle echoed, a signal unlike any before. From the shadows beyond, the trees, a faint flicker of movement, ghost-like and swift, slipped between the gnarled trunks. Ella's breath caught. The world seemed to still for a heartbeat as those hidden eyes fixed on the unraveling chaos. Eyes not belonging to Apache, nor patrol, but strangers. Observers with silent intent. And then, with brutal clarity, the sound of a rifle's crack shattered all hope of calm. The bullet tore through the morning air, straight toward Ella's heart. The moment froze. The fragile thread of mercy twisted tight into a noose. The story, standing on the brink, between salvation and ruin, held its breath. The rifle's crack tore through the stillness, its echo a jagged scar on the fragile morning calm. Ella's breath caught, time slowing as if the very air hesitated. Her heart thundered like a stallion's frantic gallop, limbs frozen by instinct and disbelief. The bullet's deadly flight was aimed true, a cold promise of sudden ruin. But fate, unpredictable as the shifting sands beyond the rancho, played its hand. A sharp, desperate shout cut through the chaos, a voice breaking from the shadows with fierce urgency. Suddenly, a figure leaped forward, catching Ella's arm just as the bullet grazed past, embedding itself in the rough wooden beam behind where she had stood. The impact splintered wood, showering dust and splinters as the world exploded back into motion. "Ella!" The voice was raw, edged with desperate fear. The newcomer's face was shadowed, eyes wild yet resolute, a man whose steps had been silent up to that moment, now fierce as a storm unleashed. He pushed past the startled patrol, pressing closer to where the wounded Apache still lay, gasping beneath the terrible weight of pain. The patrol surged, rifles raised again, but the Apache warriors tightened their circle, muscles coiled and ready, faces fierce rectangles of determination and warning. The tension snapped taut, like the string of a drawn bow, ready to release violence with a sudden roar. Ella swallowed her fear, feeling the sting of sweat and dust on her skin. She glanced at the wounded warrior, the rough lines of his face softened by unbearable pain, eyes still flickering with the same wary trust he had offered her moments before. Somehow, in this storm forged by fear and duty, an unspoken promise lingered, a fragile vow to survive, to protect. The patrol leader barked orders, his voice grim and unyielding. "This ends now. Surrender the man." But the man who had pulled Ella back refused to comply. "He's dying. You take him to bleed out. In your prison bars, like a wolf trapped in a cage. No justice in that." His voice broke, but conviction shone clear as the dawn. A low growl rose from the Apache warriors. The ground vibrated beneath pounding hooves as they shifted, signaling readiness for battle. Dust spiraled upward, stinging eyes, choking the silence. Ella's gaze flicked to the small girl still clutching her doll, now pressed close behind the cabin's heavy oak door. The sight of her innocent face, wide and uncomprehending, stoked a fire deep within Ella's chest. This was no longer about survival or law. It was about the fragile thread of humanity they all clung to, fragile as cracked earth beneath a merciless sun. The patrol moved forward, rifles brushing the backs of their horses. The delicate truce shattered. A sudden, sharp command in Apache echoed, slicing. Through tense breaths, amid the growing chaos, the wounded warrior's voice, hoarse and barely strength to speak, rippled through the din. "No. Debt can be paid if we." His eyes locked on Ella's, overwhelmed with a fierce mixture of apology and warning. The words trailed off as pain twisted his features. Ella reached toward him, steadying his trembling hand. "We'll find a way," she whispered fiercely. "Not through blood. Not now." The intruding patrol closed in, their faces hard masks of authority and suspicion. But then, without warning, the unexpected happened. A fierce guttural yell erupted just beyond the clearing, a sound primal and raw, echoing off distant rocks and rousing the wind itself. Heads turned. A cloud of dust billowed at the edge of the scrub brush, and from it, figures emerged. Mounted men riding fast and low, their silhouettes jagged and wild against the morning light. Not Apache, not patrol. Outlaws. The unexpected saviors, or another bane? No one could tell in that breathless instant. The men bore no colors, only desperation. They rode hard, guns drawn, eyes fierce pools of fire and calculation. Chaos spiraled outward like wildfire. The patrol responded with a volley of shouts, spurs digging deep, pistols firing in blind bursts. Horses screamed and reared, a tangle of bodies and weapons erupting in brutal melee beneath the merciless sun. Ella, heart pounding a war drum's cadence, seized the chance. She dragged the wounded warrior toward the side entrance of the cabin, every step a strain against the rising tide of violence. The small girl clung to her skirts, silent now, eyes wide and unblinking in the storm's eye. Ella squeezed her hand tight, as if anchoring herself to a thread of hope amidst the storm of gunfire and fury. Inside, the air was thick, suffused with sweat, fear, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The faint sounds of struggle echoed in broken waves, each crash of hooves and barked command hammering the tension inside like relentless thunder. Ella worked quickly, tying rough bandages tighter around the warrior's torso, her fingers slick with blood and dust. The warrior's eyes met hers once more. Unspoken gratitude mixed with grim determination. Suddenly, a loud crack reverberated nearby. A rider felled, horse thrown into panic. The girl's frightened cry shattered the fragile veil of silence they'd managed to find. Ella's gaze shot to the doorway, heart sinking as she spotted the silhouette of a man striding forward with deadly intent. His rifle was raised again, but this time his expression bore an unmistakable recognition, a cold personal vendetta shining in his eyes. "Ella," he spat, voice low and venomous, "you don't know what you've stirred." The moment hung poised between salvation and collapse, every breath a brittle edge. Behind him, the ragged banner of outlaws surged closer, the distant rumble of war swelling like a gathering storm. Ella tightened her grip on the warrior's hand. "We face what comes, together." The man smiled, a cruel twist that bled menace into the dawn. "Then prepare yourself, because the reckoning has only just begun." And as the cabin door splintered beneath trembling fists outside, a sharp crack cracked the dawn again, this time ringing suddenly near Ella's feet. She looked down. Half buried in the cracked earth lay a blood-stained arrow, its shaft wicked and foreign. Something else had arrived. Something unseen, yet deadly. The frontier whispered one final truth before the chapter's end. The storm was far from over, and the true fight was only beginning. The rifle's crack tore through the stillness, its echo a jagged scar on the fragile morning calm. Ella's breath caught, time slowing as if the very air hesitated. Her heart thundered like a stallion's frantic gallop, limbs frozen by instinct and disbelief. The bullet's deadly flight was aimed true, a cold promise of sudden ruin. But fate, unpredictable as the shifting sands beyond the rancho, played its hand. A sharp, desperate shout cut through the chaos, a voice breaking from the shadows with fierce urgency. Suddenly, a figure leaped forward, catching Ella's arm just as the bullet grazed past, embedding itself in the rough wooden beam behind where she had stood. The impact splintered wood, showering dust and splinters as the world exploded back into motion. "Ella!" The voice was raw, edged with desperate fear. The newcomer's face was shadowed, eyes wild yet resolute. A man whose steps had been silent up to that moment, now fierce as a storm unleashed. He pushed past the startled patrol, pressing closer to where the wounded Apache still lay, gasping beneath the terrible weight of pain. The patrol surged, rifles raised again, but the Apache warriors tightened their circle, muscles coiled and ready, faces fierce rectangles of determination and warning. The tension snapped taut like the string of a drawn bow, ready to release violence with a sudden roar. Ella swallowed her fear, feeling the sting of sweat and dust on her skin. She glanced at the wounded warrior, the rough lines of his face softened by unbearable pain, eyes still flickering with the same wary trust he had offered her moments before. Somehow, in this storm forged by fear and duty, an unspoken promise lingered. A fragile vow to survive, to protect. The patrol leader barked orders, his voice grim and unyielding. "This ends now. Surrender the man." But the man who had pulled Ella back refused to comply. "He's dying. You take him to bleed out in your prison bars. Like a wolf trapped in a cage. No justice in that." His voice broke, but conviction shone clear as the dawn. A low growl rose from the Apache warriors. The ground vibrated beneath pounding hooves as they shifted, signaling readiness for battle. Dust spiraled upward, stinging eyes, choking the silence. Ella's gaze flicked to the small girl, still clutching her doll, now pressed close behind the cabin's heavy oak door. The sight of her innocent face, wide and uncomprehending, stoked a fire deep within Ella's chest. This was no longer about survival or law. It was about the fragile thread of humanity they all clung to, fragile as cracked earth beneath a merciless sun. The patrol moved forward, rifles brushing the backs of their horses. The delicate truce shattered. A sudden, sharp command in Apache echoed, slicing through tense breaths. Amid the growing chaos, the wounded warrior's voice, hoarse and barely strength to speak, rippled through the din. "No, debt can be paid if we." His eyes locked on Ella's, overwhelmed with a fierce mixture of apology and warning. The words trailed off as pain twisted his features. Ella reached toward him, steadying his trembling hand. "We'll find a way," she whispered fiercely. "Not through blood. Not now." The intruding patrol closed in. Their faces hard masks of authority and suspicion. But then, without warning, the unexpected happened. A fierce, guttural yell erupted just beyond the clearing, a sound primal and raw, echoing off distant rocks and rousing the wind itself. Heads turned, a cloud of dust billowed at the edge of the scrub brush, and from it, figures emerged, mounted men riding fast and low, their silhouettes jagged and wild against the morning light. Not Apache, not patrol, outlaws, the unexpected saviors or another bane. No one could tell in that breathless instant. The men bore no colors, only desperation. They rode hard, guns drawn, eyes fierce pools of fire and calculation. Chaos spiraled outward like wildfire. The patrol responded with a volley of shouts, spurs digging deep, pistols firing in blind bursts. Horses screamed and reared, a tangle of bodies and weapons erupting. In brutal melee, beneath the merciless sun, Ella, heart pounding a war drum's cadence, seized the chance. She dragged the wounded warrior toward the side entrance of the cabin, every step a strain against the rising tide of violence. The small girl clung to her skirts, silent now, eyes wide and unblinking in the storm's eye. Ella squeezed her hand tight, as if anchoring herself to a thread of hope amidst the storm of gunfire and fury. Inside, the air was thick, suffused with sweat, fear, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. The faint sounds of struggle echoed in broken waves, each crash of hooves and barked command, hammering the tension inside like relentless thunder. Ella worked quickly, tying rough bandages tighter around the warrior's torso, her fingers slick with blood and dust. The warrior's eyes met hers once more, unspoken gratitude mixed with grim determination. Suddenly, a loud crack reverberated nearby. A rider felled, horse thrown into panic. The girl's frightened cry shattered the fragile veil of silence they'd managed to find. Ella's gaze shot to the doorway, heart sinking as she spotted the silhouette of a man striding forward with deadly intent. His rifle was raised again, but this time his expression bore an unmistakable recognition, a cold, personal vendetta shining in his eyes. "Ella," he spat, voice low and venomous, "you don't know what you've stirred." The moment hung poised between salvation and collapse, every breath a brittle edge. Behind him, the ragged banner of outlaws surged closer, the distant rumble of war swelling like a gathering storm. Ella tightened her grip on the warrior's hand. "We face what comes, together." The man smiled, a cruel twist that bled menace into the dawn. "Then prepare yourself, because the reckoning has only just begun." And as the cabin door splintered beneath trembling fists outside, a sharp crack cracked the dawn again, this time ringing suddenly near Ella's feet. She looked down. Half buried in the cracked earth lay a blood-stained arrow, its shaft wicked and foreign. Something else had arrived. Something unseen, yet deadly. The splintering crash of the door echoed like a gunshot through the tense morning air. Dust swirling in thick, choking clouds. Ella's breath caught in her throat as rough hands forced the timber aside, revealing the grim faces of the territorial patrol. Eyes hard as flint, rifles leveled with ruthless intent. "Ella, step aside," barked the patrol leader, his voice a harsh whip cracking the fragile silence. "You harbor an enemy of the territory. This ends now." Her body tensed, instinct rooting her in place. She stepped forward, placing herself between the wounded Apache warrior and the advancing men. "He's no enemy while he breathes here," she said, voice steady but threaded with iron. The patrol hesitated, the circle tightening outside, shifting uneasily beneath restless hooves. The Apache warriors formed a living, breathing shield, faces painted with fierce determination, weapons at the ready. Their eyes locked with hers. A silent warning. The price of crossing this line would be paid in blood. Inside her chest, a war drum thundered. Ella glanced at the man she saved, his shallow breaths ragged against the stain of dark blood seeping beneath the rough bandages she'd tied. His eyes, sharp with pain and lingering mistrust, met hers. No words passed, but a fierce promise flickered between them. Survival was no longer hers alone to command. A sudden whistle, sharp and commanding, cut through the cacophony outside. One warrior stepped forward, his voice a low rumble mingling Apache tongue and broken Spanish. Justice or mercy, he spoke, each word weighted with the heavy burden of tribal law. Decision must be made. Ella's gaze didn't waver. He would die without mercy. So long as breath fills his lungs, there is life. Murmurs passed among the warriors, unease settling like dust on an uneasy wind. The code of blood and honor clashed with the raw truth of the moment. One fragile life hanging between two worlds. Through the tension, a child's soft cry, a fragile thread against the storm, cut through the turmoil. Ella's heart twisted as a small girl appeared in the doorway. No more than 7, her wide dark eyes shimmered with tears, clutching a tattered doll as if it were a talisman. The warriors stiffened, the raw hostility, briefly, melting into cautious reverence for innocence. Ella reached out, beckoning her nearer. The child's tiny fingers found hers, trembling, but seeking comfort amid the chaos. One warrior's voice broke the quiet. "She yours?" Ella nodded, voice a whisper. "She is all I have left." The fragile barrier between compassion and fury held only thinly. Outside, the patrol surged forward, rifles bristling, faces carved from granite. Suddenly, guns cracked, pistols blazing fire into the dawn. Horses reared, hooves pounding in a wild symphony of war. Ella grabbed the wounded man's arm. "We must move." Pain lashed across his face, but his grit tightened, a silent vow to endure the tempest with her, amid the roar of battle. The child's frightened cry pierced the din, shelter shattered. The boundaries between friend and foe blurred into desperation's raw face. Ella dragged the warrior to a side door. Every step a fierce battle against the swell of violence. Inside, thick air tasted of salt, sweat, and gunpowder. The faint echoes of hoofbeats and shouted commands hammered the walls with relentless fury. Working with fevered hands, Ella tightened bandages around the warrior's broken ribs. Blood and dust slicked her fingers, but her touch never faltered. His eyes found hers, unspoken gratitude burning bright despite his pain. Then a crack, a rider thrown, horse rearing in panic. The tiny girl's cry shattered the fragile calm. Ella's gaze snapped to the doorway. A man, tall, silhouette sharp as a blade, strode forward, rifle poised, eyes cold and merciless. Recognition flashed. Like lightning between them. This was no stranger. A ghost from shadows past, bearing a personal vendetta. "Ella," he spat, venom dripping from the name. "You don't know what you've unleashed." The room stilled, all breath held tight in the face of threat. Behind him, the ragged banner of outlaws surged closer. A wild storm of desperation and wrath. No colors marked them, only the raw hunger for chaos and survival. The patrol scrambled for position, the air thick with the smell of fear and gunpowder. Ella's hand clenched tightly around the warriors, grounding herself in that fragile anchor of humanity. "I'm ready," she whispered, voice fierce. "Whatever comes." The man smiled, a cruel curve of lips steeped in menace. "Then prepare yourself. The reckoning has only begun." Suddenly, The cabin door bowed under pounding fists once more. A sharp crack ripped the calm again, this time at Ella's feet. She looked down, heart lurching. Half buried in cracked earth lay a blood-stained arrow, its wicked shaft glinting like a serpent's fang. Unseen eyes watched from shadows deeper than the trees, waiting. The frontier whispered its cruel truth. The true storm was only just awakening. The bullet tore through the morning air, a hiss of death that nearly stole Ella's breath away. Time seemed to slow, the world narrowing to the sharp crack and the splintering wood behind where she had stood. The arrow of fate missed its mark by inches, embedding itself in the thick beam of the cabin's porch with a violent shudder. A desperate shout broke the silence. "Ella!" The voice crashed from the shadows, rough with panic and resolve. From the thicket emerged a figure, moving like the gust of a storm unleashed. His hands caught her arm, steadying her trembling frame, just as the dust from the shattered beam rained around them. The territorial patrol faltered, rifles wavering as a tense standoff blossomed. But the Apache warriors did not yield. Their circle tightened, faces painted in defiant streaks of blood and earth. Muscles coiled beneath taut sinews that promised fury. The unspoken challenge hung heavy in the morning haze. A taut wire ready to snap. Ella swallowed the fierce knot of fear tightening her throat. She glanced back to the warrior, whose breaths were shallow and ragged, eyes flickering with pain and a fragile trust she dared not break. Her fingers tightened over his, a promise forged in silent desperation. The patrol leader barked a command, voice cold and unyielding. "This ends now. Surrender him." But the man who dragged Ella from the bullet's path stepped forward unwavering. "He's dying. You lock him in your iron cages. You condemn him to bleed alone. That's no justice." His voice cracked like a thorny branch underfoot, but beneath it burned a steady flame of conviction. Low growls rose from the Apache warriors, a warning rumble that shook the dust beneath hooves. The earth seemed to pulse, the charged silence shattered by restless movements and grinding resolve. Ella's gaze rose sharply to the doorway, where the small girl clung tightly to a tattered doll, eyes wide and shimmering with a storm of tears and terror. The stubborn thread of innocence wrapped around her heart, lighting a fierce fire deep inside. This was no longer just a game of survival or codes. It was about the fragile humanity clinging to breath and bone under this merciless sun. Without warning, the patrol advanced, rifles brushing the flanks of their horses as they tightened the circle. The delicate truce shattered like brittle glass underfoot. An ancient word rang out, a sharp, commanding call in Apache tongue, slicing through the tension like an arrow. The wounded warrior's voice, faint and broken, rose above the growing chaos. "No debt can be paid if we—" His eyes bore into Ella's, a red-hot mixture of apology and warning, burning through the pain. The words trailed into silence as agony twisted his face. Ella reached out, steadying his trembling hand. "We will find another way," she whispered fiercely. "Not through blood, not now." The patrol closed in, their masks cold and unforgiving. Authority etched across tight jaws. Suddenly, the wild cry of a primal yell erupted beyond the clearing, shuddering through the desert air like thunder wrung from bone. Heads turned toward a roiling dust cloud, billowing from the scrub brush, heralding an unknown force. Mounted riders surged into view, riding low and fast. Ragged survivors cloaked in desperation. Neither Apache nor patrol, faces grim and eyes alight with fiery calculation. Outlaws, their bare colors folded into shadows, they charged with the fury of wolves unleashed. Guns drawn and wild as the frontier itself. Chaos exploded, spurred horses screamed, pistols spat fire, and bodies tangled in desperate melee beneath the unforgiving sun. The meadow erupted into a maelstrom of war. Amid the storm, Ella seized her chance, dragging the wounded warrior toward the cabin's side entrance. Every step was a battle against the merciless pull of conflict. The girl's clammy hand clung to Ella's skirts, silent now in the heart of the storm, her wide eyes frozen in the cyclone's eye. Ella's grip tightened, anchoring herself to this slender thread of hope. Inside, the air was thick with salt sweat, fear, and the choking sting of gunpowder. Faint echoes of hoofbeats and shouted orders hammered the walls like a relentless drum. Ella worked feverishly, tightening rough bandages around the warrior's bruised ribs. Blood and dust slicked her fingers, but her touch was steady, determined. His eyes, glassed with pain, found hers in a moment heavy with unspoken gratitude and defiant will. A sharp crack rang out, a rider thrown, panic igniting the horse as it reared wildly. The small girl stifled a frightened cry that shattered the fragile calm like a dropped glass. Ella's gaze snapped to the doorway. A tall figure approached. Silhouette, carved in cold resolve, rifle raised with deadly purpose. Recognition struck sharp and sudden. This was no stranger. Dark history gleamed in his eyes, a hunger for vengeance wrapped in cold intent. Ella, he spat, venom dripping with each syllable. You have no idea what you've unleashed. The room held its breath. Every pulse beat loud against the heavy silence. Behind him, ragged outlaws surged forward, a dark tide of desperation and fury, rolling thick with the stench of war. No banners marked them, only raw survival etched on faces twisted with wild calculation. The patrol scrambled to respond, rifles lifted once more, the air thickening with the acrid bite of fear and gunpowder. Ella locked her gaze onto the warriors, holding his frail hand like a lifeline in the storm's eye. I'm ready, she whispered, armor forged from steel. And fire. Whatever's coming. A cruel smile twisted the man's lips, seeping menace into the dawn. Good, because the reckoning is only just beginning. Suddenly, the cabin door groaned beneath pounding fists anew. A sharp crack split the quiet one more time, this time at Ella's feet. She looked down, heart seizing. Half buried in the cracked earth lay an arrow, stained dark with blood, its wicked shaft poised like a viper ready to strike. And from the shadows beyond the gnarled trees, unseen eyes watched and waited, silent, patient, and deadly. The frontier whispered its cruel truth again. The true storm had only just awoken. The sharp report of the rifle echoed like thunder split open, the crack tearing through the fragile morning calm. Time slowed, each heartbeat hammering against the stillness. Dust and splinters rained down from the shattered wooden beam behind where Ella had stood moments before. The bullet missed by mere inches, an invisible razor cutting the air where her chest had been seconds ago. A desperate voice shattered the suspended moment. "Ella!" The shout came raw and urgent from the shadows. From the thicket emerged a figure, moving with the silent fury of a gathering storm. Rough hands grasped her arm, steadying her trembling frame, just as the world exploded back into motion. The territorial patrol faltered, rifles wavering as tension snapped taut. Outside, the Apache warriors tightened their circle, faces fierce, masks painted with blood and earth. Their muscles coiled with the promise of unleashed fury, bodies poised like wild cats in an endless standoff. Ella swallowed the choking knot of dread tightening her throat. Her gaze flickered to the wounded man on the floor. A warrior ravaged by pain, his breaths ragged, eyes flickering with a fragile trust. Her fingers tightened over his palm, a silent vow tethered by desperation. The patrol leader barked cold orders, voice grim and unyielding. "This ends now. Surrender the man." But the figure who had saved Ella's life stepped forward, unwavering. His voice was ripe with conviction, breaking like thunder over the desert plains. "He's dying. You lock him in your iron cages to bleed alone. That is no justice." The low growl rising from the Apache warriors vibrated through the parched earth, stirring dust in demonic spirals. Hooves stamped, muscles tensed, and the fragile truce shattered as raw savagery edged closer to bursting. A sharp, stinging cry cut through the charged air. A child's voice, shattering the savage tension. The small girl, clutching her worn doll, pressed close behind the cabin door, eyes wide in trembling silence. Ella's heart clenched. This fragile thread of innocence, a stark contrast to the storm brewing beyond these walls. The patrol shifted forward, rifles grazing their horses' flanks as they advanced. The circle tightened. The scent of gunpowder and sweat thickened the air. Suddenly, a piercing cry rang out, an ancient Apache command slicing the blaring tension like a razor through silk. The wounded warrior's raspy voice broke through the chaos. "No debt can be paid if we." His eyes locked on Ella's, fierce and pleading, drowning in pain and apology. His words trailed away as agony twisted his features. Ella reached out, steadying his trembling hand. "We will find another way," she whispered, voice firm and resolute. "Not through blood, not here, not now." The patrol moved closer, their faces carved from stone, authority cold as desert night. Then, from across the clearing came a guttural yell, a raw, feral sound that froze breath mid-chest. Heads snapped toward a cloud of dust billowing on the horizon. Mounted riders charged fast and low, silhouettes jagged against the pale morning sun. They bore no colors, no banners, faces worn and wild, eyes pools of desperation and fire. Outlaws. The air exploded into fevered chaos. Spurs dug deep, pistols spat bursts of fire. Horses reared and screamed as bodies tangled in brutal melee beneath the burning sky. Ella seized her moment, dragging the wounded warrior toward the cabin's side entrance. Every step felt like a battle waged against the swelling tide of frenzied violence. The girl's small, clammy hand clung to Ella's skirts, eyes wide, frozen within the storm's eye. Ella squeezed her tightly, anchoring herself to hope in the heart of chaos. Inside, the air thickened with sweat, dust, and acrid gunpowder. Broken echoes of hoofbeats and desperate orders hammered against rough walls, each crash pounding a relentless rhythm. Ella's hands worked feverishly, tightening rough bandages over bruised ribs. Her fingers, slick with blood and dust, moved with precision, born from desperation. The warrior's eyes found hers, a flicker of gratitude fierce amid the pain. Then came a sharp, sickening crack, a rider down, horse thrown into panic. The child's frightened cry shattered the fragile veil of silence like a dropped glass. Ella's gaze snapped upward. A tall figure strode forward through the dust and gunfire, rifle raised with deadly intent. Recognition surged like ice water. This was no stranger. Dark history gleamed in his glinting eyes, cold as the approaching storm. "Ella," he spat, venom dripping from the word. "You don't know what you've unleashed." The room hushed, every breath held tight in the grip of threat. Behind him, ragged outlaws surged forward, a wild tide of desperation and wrath. No colors marked them, only raw survival etched on faces twisted by hunger and rage. The patrol scrambled, rifles raised anew. The acrid bite of gunpowder thickened the heavy air. Ella locked eyes with the warrior, holding his trembling hand as tightly as her own life depended on it. "I'm ready," she whispered, voice steel forged in fire. "Whatever comes." The man smiled, cruel and thin. "Good, because the reckoning has only begun." Suddenly, pounding fists shook the cabin door anew. A sharp crack split the morning, this time at Ella's feet. She looked down, breath caught cold in her chest. Half buried in cracked earth lay a wicked shaft tipped with blood. An arrow, cruel and foreign. From the shadows beyond the gnarled trees, unseen eyes watched patiently, silent, lethal, waiting. The frontier whispered its haunting truth once more. The storm was only beginning, and its deadliest winds had yet to blow. The bullet's whistle still echoed faintly in Ella's ears as she stumbled back, her heart slamming against her ribs with a fury she'd never known. The shattered wooden beam hung over her head like a jagged wound in the morning light. Dust swirled around her, thick and choking, as the world snapped back into motion, chaos blooming like wildfire across the rancho. The man who had seized her arm, his face shadowed but eyes fierce as a storm unleashed, pulled her from the line of fire just in time. "Stay close," he gritted. His breath came harsh, mingling with the acrid sweat and blood in the air. Behind them, the territorial patrol's rifles rattled as their fingers tightened on triggers, the cold edge of law turning merciless beneath the rising sun. But the Apache warriors were no less ready, their painted faces carved with the weight of ancient code, muscles coiling beneath sweat-streaked skin, like wild panthers ready to spring. Ella's gaze flicked across the ragged circle outside the cabin. Sensing the tight coil of tension, the invisible wire stretched thin between mercy and vengeance. Her eyes returned to the wounded warrior sprawled on the floor, each shallow breath a fragile tether between life and the abyss. The deep gash on his ribs pulsed with relentless agony, yet behind the flicker of pain, his wary eyes held a faint, reluctant trust. "We don't have much time," the man whispered, voice low but fierce. "They'll break through if we don't act." Ella swallowed the knot of fear tightening her throat. She pressed her fingers to the warrior's clammy hand, willing strength into him, even as the invisible noose of their predicament tightened. Outside, hooves slapped the hard earth, a threatening drumbeat to their fragile stand. From the mounting tension burst the sharp cry of the Apache warrior who had stepped forward earlier. His words came in a low rumble, weaving broken Spanish with the harsh harmony of his native tongue. "Justice is our law. Mercy is a stranger here. You dragged us into the storm, woman." Ella's eyes did not falter. "The law of blood is cruel," she answered steadily. "But mercy isn't weakness. It is survival." The warriors exchanged glances, shadows of centuries ghosting their faces. Somewhere deep beneath the dust and gunfire lay a desperate yearning for honor to bend toward life, even if only for a breath. Suddenly, the faint cry of a child shattered the tension like glass. Ella's breath stuttered as a small figure stepped cautiously into the doorway. The girl's dark eyes, wide and shimmering with tears, locked onto Ella with a silent plea. "This is mine," Ella said quietly, voice thick with memories no words could untangle. "She is all I have left." The warriors tensed, weapons half raised, but the child's presence carved a fragile island of innocence amid the tempest. For a moment, the boundaries between foe and protector wavered as the small hand clasped Ella's with desperate trust. Then, as if the fragile moment was a spark, in dry grass, the sharp crack of gunfire split the air. The cabin door burst open under the brutal force of pounding fists. Men in the green of the territorial patrol swarmed inside, rifles sweeping with lethal precision. "Ella, step aside!" barked the patrol leader, eyes hard as flint. "The man you harbor is a wanted enemy. Surrender him now or face the law. He is no enemy while he draws breath here." The guards hesitated as the Apache warriors surged forward in response, forming a living barrier of bodies and wills. Faces marked by war and sorrow leveled fierce warnings. There would be no easy victories this day. Ripples of tension snapped through the cabin. Hooves stamped, weapons shifted, breaths caught. Ella glanced down at the girl clutching her ragged doll, face pale but eyes burning with quiet courage. Amid the rising storm, the wounded man's cracked voice wavered, a fragile thread of sound snaking through the chaos. "No, debt can be paid if we—" His gaze locked on Ella's. Apology and warning burned deep in those eyes. The pain twisted his features, but the hint of defiance lingered. "We'll find another way," Ella vowed fiercely, steadying his trembling hand. "Not through blood, not today." Before either side could answer, A guttural roar tore through the clearing, a fierce call summoned from the very bones of the earth. Dust billowed at the edge of the horizon, figures charging fast and low, their ragged silhouettes slicing the dawn like storm shadows. Outlaws. Their faces were hard, their eyes empty wells of desperation and cunning. No colors marked allegiance, only survival etched in every line of their wild features. Guns drawn, they rode straight into the heart of the turmoil. The patrol rallied, the clash unfolding in a brutal, roaring torrent of pistols, shouts, and furious hooves. The fragile truce shattered, plunging the rancho into a sudden tempest of violence. Ella seized the moment, hauling the wounded man toward the cabin's side entrance. She fought against the tide of chaos swelling around them. Her heart hammered a wild rhythm, matching the storm of battle, growing fiercer with every breath. Behind her, the child clung to the edge of her tattered dress, eyes cries carved the silence to pieces. Ella worked fast, tightening bandages over the warrior's cracked ribs, fingers slick with his blood and dust. His eyes found hers, silent gratitude burning in their depths. Suddenly, a sharp, sickening crack rang out, a rider thrown, horse rearing in panic. The girl's frightened cry pierced the chaos. Ella darted a glance to the doorway. There stood a man she never wished to see again, shadow carved sharp by the morning sun, rifle raised and cold hatred burning in his eyes. "Ella," he sneered, venom dripping with every syllable, "you have no idea what you've brought down on us all." Behind him, the outlaw band surged forward like a boiling flood, desperation and wrath coiling tight in their wild faces. No banners flew here, only the savage law of survival writ deep in scars and blood. Ella gripped the warrior's hand, steadying herself against the rising storm. "We face it all, together," she whispered. The man's cruel smile cut through the dawn. "Then prepare yourself. The reckoning has only begun." The cabin door creaked under pounding fists again, splinters flying. A sudden crack echoed at Ella's feet. Her eyes dropped. An arrow lay half-buried in the cracked earth, its wicked, blood-stained tip gleaming like a serpent's fang. Unseen eyes fixed on the chaos from shadows beyond the trees, patient, silent, deadly. The frontier whispered one final, terrible truth. The true storm had only just begun to howl. The acrid smoke hung heavy as the dust settled over the broken cabin door. Ella's hand remained locked in the wounded man's, their grip a fragile tether amid the chaos. Around them, the battlefield of raised rifles and furious horses gradually stilled, the fierce roar fading into a tense hush. The outlaw riders scattered into the scrub, the territorial patrol and Apache warriors retreating to lick their wounds and reconsider the cost of this brutal morning. Ella's breath trembled, caught between exhaustion and relief. But the ache in her chest was sharper still. The bloodied arrow at her feet had spoken a silent warning. There was more to face. Shadows beyond this violent storm. Yet the immediate terror had passed, for now. She turned her gaze slowly to the warrior. He lay pale but steady, the ragged bandages soaked but holding firm against the cruel wound that had threatened to steal him from their world. His dark eyes, wary but softened now, flickered with a faint light that had been absent. Only hours before. "You're still here," Ella whispered. "Still fighting." His lips parted in a faint, dry smile. "Because you saved me," he murmured, voice raspy but resolute. "Because you showed mercy when none was due." Ella shook her head softly. "It wasn't mercy. It was humanity. Something this land has forgotten." A slow breath escaped him, deeper now, filling empty spaces within. Outside, the early sun climbed higher, casting golden light through the battered window and onto the cracked wooden floor, painting a fragile promise of hope across the dust. Suddenly, footsteps sounded softly at the cabin entrance. The small girl stepped inside, eyes wide with a cautious curiosity, clutching her worn doll. Ella's heart clenched as the child's gaze shifted between her and the grim figure who had come to symbolize so much pain and tentative salvation. "She's safe," Ella said gently, reaching for the girl's hand and drawing her close. "Safe as long as we hold fast." The warrior's eyes followed the child with something like recognition, a silent acknowledgement of innocence amid scars. He shifted painfully, but then, with surprising steadiness, pushed himself up on one elbow. "The storm will pass," he said hoarsely, looking out toward the horizon, where the dust still lingered like ghosts of the battle. "But the reckoning is not over." Ella met his gaze with unwavering resolve. "We decide what comes next, together." Outside, the remaining Apache warriors gathered, faces marked by exhaustion and respect. Their painted expressions softened as they approached, voices low but filled with a solemn acceptance. The deep code of honor had been shaken, but not broken. A fragile truce had forged from the fire of blood, strange, uneasy, but real. One warrior stepped forward, his voice rough, but carrying an unspoken peace. "We honor your choice, woman. You have been true to the law of our people and to the life you chose to save." Ella nodded, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders, replaced by something heavier. Hope tempered by the lessons of loss. The territorial patrol lingered at the edge of the clearing, their leader stepping forward. He met Ella's gaze with a reluctant respect, words clipped but sincere. "This man's fate will rest with the council, but the violence must end here." Ella's gaze swept the battered land around them, the ruined door, the scattered weapons, the child's quiet presence. "Then let it end, here, now." As the sun rose fully over the jagged ridges, a breeze stirred the sagebrush, carrying with it the scents of cedar and earth and something new, the fragile breath of healing. Ella sat beside the wounded warrior once more, the girl nestled at her side. Words came slow, a promise forming in the quiet between them. "You have given me a second chance," he said, voice steadying. "I will not waste it." "And I," Ella answered, "will keep this place, for you, for her, for what we can build beyond hate and fear." Outside, the frontier stretched endless, a vast canvas of dust and sky. But for the first time in many seasons, it seemed less a battlefield and more a path, one walked together. Night came gently, the stars kindling above like watchful eyes. The warrior slept, strengthened by the dawn, while Ella and the girl whispered stories that wove the past with the promise of tomorrow. The old wounds of the land would not vanish in a day, nor would the scars in those who bore them. But here, in this small cabin, cradled by the vast wilderness, mercy and courage had found their fragile home. The story that had begun in fear and blood closed now on a quiet truth. Even in the harshest places, humanity could bloom, stubborn and wild as the desert sage. And so, the frontier watched and waited, as a new chapter blossomed from the dust, a chapter of peace, of understanding, and of a promise kept. Ella whispered into the night, "We are not alone." And beneath the vast velvet sky, the future stretched out, a boundless horizon for those daring enough to shape it with hands strong, hearts open, and souls unbroken.